thanks, Jan. It's my pleasure to be here. Always grateful to have a Canadian come down and tell you about American energy. I am a fellow with the Post-Carbon Institute, which is headquartered in Santa Rosa, California. So I'm not completely devoid of American contacts. Shale gas is what I'm going to talk to you about mainly, but also I'll touch just a bit on the Backend. I've done a lot of data analysis on all of the drilling data, and I've really tried to take apart the shale gas and tight oil plays. And like Art, I'm a data guy. I'm really not a forecaster. Huge amount of optimism on gas, 100 years of gas. Statements like this from the Pickens Plan. There's so much natural gas that there's enough available to displace half of the coal-burning power plants in the US. We have enough domestic natural gas to fuel our trucks and fleet vehicles. Studies from prestigious energy firms and universities have affirmed the dream of clean, abundant, homegrown energy is now reality with the help of shale gas, and that's the American Natural Gas Alliance in Washington. The Utica Shale is the biggest thing to hit Ohio since the plow. That's Aubrey McLennan, former CEO of Chesapeake. The EIA is very bullish on shale gas. This is their latest reference case forecast. And they're suggesting that shale gas will be 49% of US production by 2035. It's already about 40%, so possibly we'll get there. The bad news about this slide is that most other sources of gas are declining or flat going forward in this projection. The US is forecast to be a net exporter of gas by about 2021. If you look at the utilization of gas in that reference case forecast, you can see that in terms of transportation fuels, compressed natural gas is going to grow but still be negligible as a total use. There's about 150,000 natural gas fueled vehicles in the US right now. Maybe they'll get that to 1 million. The total fleet of cars in the US is about 250 million, so it's just not scalable to replace a significant amount of transportation. The same thing with electricity. Market share of gas for electricity will grow somewhat, but it will certainly not replace coal in this forecast. If we look at the last couple of decades of US natural gas production and drilling, the drilling is in red. A huge bubble of drilling between about 2006 and 2008. The number of wells drilled per year tripled. And we saw a turnaround in gas supply, and it started to grow again. So part of the growth that we're seeing today is due to the hangover of wells yet to be connected from that drilling bubble. And it's also due to the general higher productivity of shale gas wells. If we look at the distribution of shale gas, this is one map that basically shows shale gas being very widespread. The question is, are all of these plays uniform? And the answer is no. There's a huge amount of variability in terms of the amount of gas that you can actually get out of these plays. Shale gas is, of course, technologically driven, multi-stage hydraulic fracturing, and this is vertical and horizontal wells drilled into the Barnett Shale, which was really first. Virtually none back in 2004. Once it was understood the usefulness and utility of horizontal wells, today 93% of Barnett Shale production comes from horizontals. And if we look at the evolution of horizontal drilling in the US, we can see that probably less than 10% back in the early part of the last decade. Today, 61% of all gas, or all oil and gas wells are horizontal. The EIA projection of gas price is low for the foreseeable future. If we look at history, we can see the volatility of gas. The black is the price of NYMEX gas. We can see that today the price of gas in Japan is about $18 an MCF versus less than $4 in the US. And the EIA is suggesting that we can continue to grow gas production with very low and non-volatile gas prices. I would say that's wishful thinking. They're suggesting that gas will be less than $8 an MCF in 2035. One forecast of gas price is different between the different shale plays. In this forecast, the best 20% of your wells may break even at somewhere between $3.50 and $4. The worst 20% need somewhere between $8 and $14. The mean is somewhere between $5.50 and $6 in this forecast. I think what Art Berman said 2 years ago in Washington is as true today as it was when he said it. Shale plays are marginally commercial at best, particularly at today's gas prices. The plays have consistently contracted to a core area that represents 10 to 20% of the resource that was initially claimed. The manufacturing model has failed. These are not low-cost plays. The marginal cost of production for most companies is $7.50 an MCF. And I know Art has adjusted those figures a little bit, but they're still in that range. Reserves have been greatly overstated, and 80% of booked reserves are undeveloped. If we look at the rig count between gas and oil, the gas rig count is now at the lowest level since the 1990s. And that's a real turnaround, because back in the early part of the last decade, oil was only about 10% of the total rig count. Production of shale gas has been a spectacular story of growth. This is the last 12 years of production. It's now about 40% of US supply. If we look at which plays it came from, 2/3 of all shale gas comes from the top 3 plays: the Haynesville, the Barnett, and the Marcellus. 88% comes from the top 6. So the concept that all shales are going to produce at a uniform level of productivity is not correct. And this is the average well productivity of all wells, all producing wells, in the top 7 plays. You can see how exceptional the Haynesville is in terms of average productivity, somewhere around 3 million cubic feet per day, compared to things like the Barnett at less than 500,000. I sort of have a life cycle of shale plays. The Haynesville shale is in late middle age. The Barnett is in late middle age, and some of these others, like the Woodford and the Fayetteville, are slowly declining in terms of average productivity. The Eagle Ford is declining, but that's not because of age. That's because they're switching from gas-prone areas into oil-prone areas in the Eagle Ford. If we look at the last year that I have production data for, this is a year prior to May 2012, we can see that all of the shale plays have essentially flattened out. And that's because of the drop in the rig count and moving into poorer quality geology. So I'd just like to look at a couple of shale plays in more detail, the top 2, or, well, not the top 2, actually, yes, the top 2, the Haynesville and the Barnett. And so the Haynesville is really number 1 in terms of productivity. The well count is getting close to 3,000. It's still rising. However, production is beginning to fall. This is the actual decline curve for the Haynesville. It's not a fit, not a hyperbolic fit. First year declines are about 68%, and as you go down to the fourth year, we're still at very high decline rates. You really haven't seen it flatten out into a low terminal decline. If we stop drilling on January 1st, 2011, this is what the decline would look like in the Haynesville. There's about 1,600 wells that were drilled up until that point in time, and the overall decline is about 52%. So overall decline is a mix of old wells and new wells. So 52% of Haynesville production has to be replaced by more drilling every year. So we can make a calculation of how many wells we need to offset that 52% decline. And the red, in this case, is the number of wells added in the previous year. Up until May 2011, we were adding about 900 wells per year. The black is the amount of new production added per well. And so you can see as we get down to around 800, those 800 wells are just offsetting declines. If we look at the highest 1 month productivity as a proxy for well quality, this is the distribution of the best month. The mean is a little over 8 million a day. The really spectacular wells over 20 million a day are a very small percentage of the total, but they're often the ones that we hear about when people talk about these different shale plays. So over 20 million a day in this case is about 2% of the total number of wells. If we look at the top 20%, geographically, we can see just what Art said. The best wells are clustered in sweet spots, so the black wells are the top 20% in terms of IP, and the red wells are everything else. If we look at the Barnett, we can see that the well count now is up to about 15,000. This is the oldest shale play. Production is flattening out in the Barnett, even with all those wells. Average decline rate from all wells in the Barnett. And we can see that the Barnett is much more typical. By the fifth year, we're flattening out into what looks to be close to a terminal decline of about 10 to 15% per year. First year declines are about 61%. If you stop drilling on January 1st, 2011, this is what the decline would look like. The average decline or the overall decline in the Barnett is about 30% per year. So that has to be replaced by more drilling. Well quality in the Barnett, much lower productivities in the Haynesville, as we saw. And if you look at the best wells, maybe 5% of the wells will come in at an IP of about 4 million or higher. But the mean IP is about 1.6 million cubic feet per day. Same pattern, sweet spots in the Barnett, fairly well known. So that's where the drilling effort is being concentrated. Just a close-up of that sweet spot, so you can look at the scale bar and see the density of drilling that's there right now. Many of these pads are multi-well pads, so that there's several wells drilled from each one. The question is, how many more wells can you put into the Barnett? So I looked at the prognosis. If you look at the October rig count for the top 9 shale gas plays, you can see, for example, if you look at the Haynesville, you need about 800 wells per year to offset overall decline. The October rig count was 20, and that's probably about a third to a quarter of the number of wells you need number of rigs you need to drill the 800 wells that you need to offset decline. So the prognosis for the Haynesville is rather sharp decline in my view. The Barnett rig count at 42, that's not enough. It's going to start going down. If you look at the plays that are going to grow, they're all oil-prone plays, the Backend, the Eagle Ford, with the exception of the Marcellus. The Marcellus is a young play, and production is still growing. The rig count is still fairly high at 110. If you look at how much money it's going to take to offset production declines, this is the top 14 shale plays. The Haynesville, for example, at $9 million a well, 774 wells required. You need about $7 billion per year just to offset decline in the Haynesville. The Barnett, you need about $5.2 million a year. Marcellus, being a young play, about $2.5 billion. But in total, you need 7,600 wells per year just to offset declines at a cost of about $42 billion per year. There's been a reality check in terms of shale plays, and Art's been talking about this for a couple of years. In June, Rex Tillerson, the CEO of ExxonMobil, said, "We're all losing our shirts today. We're making no money. It's all in the red." Chesapeake shareholders deliver rebuke. This is a June 2012 Globe and Mail article. Aubrey McClendon resigns as chairman of Chesapeake. Some directors replaced at the behest of shareholders. Sale of $4 billion plus in pipeline and related assets. $10 billion shortfall forecast for Chesapeake in the remainder of 2012. So they're still in the process of liquidating more assets to cover that shortfall. Just really, since other people touched on shale gas in their talks, I'll quickly touch on shale oil. The same sort of analysis. If we look at the number of oil wells drilled in the US, we can see that there's been a spectacular growth, a tripling of the number of wells. And we've seen a bit of a ramp up in terms of supply, which is the black line. We've also seen some spectacular growth forecasts for tight oil. This one from Citigroup, basically infinite well locations and no declines in overall supply out of those plays. Backend and Eagle Ford being the number one, but they're suggesting their sort of reference case is 3.7 million barrels per day of tight oil by 2022. That's only 10 years out, with the possible upside of 5 million barrels per day. The EIA forecast of tight oil, we've already heard about it, is modest compared to Citigroup, about 3.1 million barrels per day. And again, very slow declines after peaking somewhere around 2020 to 2022. The story about shale oil is really the Eagle Ford and the Backend. I looked at 19 other tight oil plays, and they're pretty much flat compared to the kind of growth that we're seeing in the Eagle Ford and the Backend. The top two plays produce 81% of all of the shale oil. The top five plays produce 92%. If we look at the Backend, and Art showed a slide similar to this, there's close to 5,000 operating wells at this point in time, and we're up approaching 600,000 barrels per day. This is as of May 2012. The decline rates, this is the average well decline in the Backend. We're still going down at about 33% in year 5. Bernstein did a research report, which I agree with, which suggests that Backend wells, on average, become stripper wells at about 10 to 15 barrels per day within 6 years. Overall field decline for the Backend, I agree. I think Art came out with 38%. I came out with 40%. So 40% of production has to be replaced each year with more drilling. The distribution of well quality, this is the highest 1 month productivity in the Backend. There's a lot of publicity about the really good wells, greater than 1,000 barrels per day when they come on. But in fact, those are probably 3 to 4% of the total number of wells. The mean productivity is about 400 barrels per day in the Backend. If you plot the top 20% and all of the other wells, the top 20% are in black here. Again, you can see the core areas very clearly defined. I think this is the partial over here on the right. Sorry, just go back. And then there's a scattering of fairly good wells elsewhere. The red being all the rest, the 80%. Just a close-up, you can see the scale of well saturation in the Backend right now, looking at that 20-mile scale bar. The EIA has come up with an estimate of how many well locations are ultimately available. In the Backend, they're suggesting a little under 12,000 in total. We're looking at a little less than 5,000 right now, so we should be able to triple or almost triple the number of wells in the Backend before we run out of locations. So I just made a projection with a lot of assumptions in it. This assumes that we'll keep drilling 1,500 wells per year in the Backend. The wells will not decline in terms of average productivity as we move out of the sweet spots into other areas, which is probably a bad assumption. And this is what production looks like, and a 40% overall decline rate. So we could, if these assumptions are correct, we could grow Backend production from where it is now to about a little under 1 million barrels per day. By 2017, we run out of locations and then we collapse at the overall field decline rate of 40%. So in this scenario, we're back to where we are today in about 2018. And all Backend wells are stripper wells by about 2022. If we drill more wells, if we up the drilling rate to 2,000 wells per year, we peak sooner at a higher level. In this case, we peak at about 1.1 million barrels per day and then collapse at the overall field decline rate. Continental would disagree with that number of well locations. They're suggesting there's something like 38,000 locations in the North Dakota portion of the Backend alone. There's also no such thing as a free lunch, and Deborah is very well versed in the environmental issues surrounding fracking and shale gas. And there's been a great deal of pushback. I think we heard some of that in some of the questions earlier today. The moratorium that's been in place in New York State, it's a moratorium in the province of Quebec in Canada. These concerns are centered around methane contamination of groundwater, the disposal of produced fracture fluid contaminating groundwater and inducing earthquakes, the industrial footprint, truck traffic, air emissions, and so forth. Full cycle greenhouse gas emissions, which may be worse than coal over the short term, if you look at the research of Bob Howarth at Cornell. And one could add to this the incredibly high consumption of water, particularly in arid states like Texas. So just in summary, shale gas has been a game changer in that it's really averted a terminal decline in supplies from conventional sources, but requires continuous high levels of capital input for drilling and infrastructure. Almost all eggs are in the shale gas basket as a hope in meeting supply growth projections. There are very significant geological, environmental, and economic challenges in continuing to grow shale gas supply. I'm like Bill, I certainly expect significantly higher gas prices going forward in the next 12 to 24 months. The hope that shale gas can make more than modest inroads on oil for transport and coal for electricity is unwarranted. even if the EIA's supply projections can be met. Shale oil, similarly, has been an important new source of oil, but suffers high decline rates, and highly productive fields are not ubiquitous, as the hype would have us believe. It is limited by available locations, which will impose a bubble-shaped production profile when they are exhausted. So I'll just leave it there. Thank you.